Hello.
Our story begins covered in rain. Jango Fett and Tyrannus stood on one of many platforms outside the Kaminoan facilities on Tipoca City. The Countess Sereno, hidden under his hood, thanked Jango for his contributions to this important mission. Dooku's skin was still soft, his beard trimmed with a dark black undertone, and gray barely slipping through into the light. It had been mere weeks since Yaddle's death, and already the dark side was taking over him. He told Jango to remain steadfast, even gesturing towards the facilities so that he might call Tipoca City a base of operations for himself. A home, if you will. Jango nodded his head, watching water pellets bounce off of his helmet. Tyrannus turned around, stepping into a solar sailor and lifting off, so that he might fly away. The fallen Jedi would soon inform his master about these developments. Jango, on the other hand, walked back into the facility, removing his helmet and greeting Lama Su. The Prime Minister of the Kaminoans spoke delicately, thanking Jango for being an assistance to them in this magnificent experiment that they were conducting. He nodded, as Lama Su moved his hands in a manner to suggest that Jango walk with him. They started down the illuminated hallways, and the Prime Minister addressed some potential cases of interest for the bounty hunter. Firstly, he understood that Jango might find interest in using one of their spare quarters for his own rest. Jango was willing to see what the facilities offered, because the life of a bounty hunter wasn't one situated at home. But with the payment he was receiving from Dooku, he might as well take a gander. They walked. Lama Su asked Fett if he had any specific requests for the clone troopers, or even if there was any interest in training them when they reached proper age. Jango had no care for these beings, but he asked that they create him an unaltered clone for himself. Lama questioned if he was looking for a son or a daughter, and Jango near instantaneously requested for the clone to be a boy. But when it came to the whole training suggestion, Jango shot it down immediately. He had no interest in the clone army. To him, this was simply a job, and he was getting paid to complete it. Lama knew better than to try and reason with the bounty hunter, so he let him be. It meant that the Prime Minister would have to look for a series of trainers or other bounty hunters to complete this task. Based on Jango's reports, early into their genetic testing with him, there weren't any other Mandalorians aside from the Death Watch that killed his people and the pacifist Duchess to pull from. This made things more challenging for Lama Su, but no need to be worried about it. He was just content that they had their genetic donor. Everything else would fall into place as it needed to. He had years to assemble trainers. Jango would eventually select a room with a view of the water, and he would have oversight into some early genetic work inside the main facilities. The Kaminoans would experiment with a small batch, using everything they were ordered to use by Dooku, and then checking to see if it would work on a much larger scale. Tons of science and variables, none of which concerning Jango. He continued making his way around the galaxy as a simple man, until he was hailed back to the Kaminoan facilities to see his son in the incubator. Jango wasn't doing much anyways. He knocked off a pirate lord in the upper part of Megiddo space, someone that used to work for a banker that needed to be disposed of. A name like Sidious hired him. Didn't really matter much to Jango, just another job. When he arrived at Tipoca City, he was relatively surprised when he saw Boba in the incubator. Unlike the other clones, Boba would be grown at a normal rate for humans, thus spending 9 months inside the incubator before being placed in an infant pod. Fett couldn't help but be overwhelmed with happiness. The realization of his request finally hit his heart, and he accepted that he was about to become a father. His instantaneous need to protect and provide for his future son overwhelmed him, but something else also came with this realization. The boy to be named Boba would be a clone, and a son. But if a clone could be considered a son, then surely every other clone of this future Grand Army would be too. That crossed Jango's mind, and it almost perplexed him into a state of mental anguish. He wasn't really one to have anxiety, and this wasn't quite that, but it was relatable in a sense. He was consumed with the same desires to provide and protect for an army of millions. These clones were being bred to literally die, and Jango took a step back. This prompted Nala Se to ask if he was alright, and Jango swallowed his worries and nodded his head, telling the lead scientist for the cloning facilities that he had gotten a little lightheaded, likely from not hydrating enough. He would reflect on these thoughts in a journal entry. While Jango didn't carry around a pretty princess journal, he did reflect on himself most nights. Whether it be in the killing of another or simply making his way through the universe, it brought him warmth. In the life of bounty hunting, there wasn't much of that. And for as cruel and as quick with a pistol as Jango was, he needed something to humanize him. Writing down inside of his datapad, which was a journal, did exactly that. It brought him a sense of comfort, because he could record his thoughts and ideas. It helped him process certain things. It's the entire reason he decided that he would have the clone son, named Boba. It all came from journal entries when he was first taking this job, and the thought crossed his mind. Jango knew it wouldn't be sustainable with his lifestyle to find a partner. That was something he had already come to peace with, so having writings from the past, he was able to pinpoint what he could and could not handle. Writing in his book this time led to him building up a fear of the future. The emotions he felt seeing Boba for the first time pushed him to wondering if the clone army would have the same effects on him. He initially sat content, feeling that he wouldn't ever get attached to the clone army, but that was before he saw them. Jango promised himself to investigate the rest of the army in the following day, because he needed the closure before taking up another job. In the coming week, he's supposed to get paired up with Cad Bane, a longtime friend of his, so they could do a mission for Hondo Anaka. It was likely going to be easy, but with Hondo, one could really never know. Jango, that night, wouldn't rest very well, which would lead to him taking a look at the clones himself. Security on Tipoca City wasn't very high anyways, so he freely walked into the room with towering incubators. Nala Se was creating Alpha and Omega in the same hall, and rooms separate from each other, as to not mess with their genetics by accident. Boba and his twin sister were going to be completely unaltered clones, aside from chromosomes. Not far from them, more experimental units were being worked on, but the point being, the rest of the clone army wasn't something Jango saw when he first was invited to see his son for the first time. As the bounty hunter walked into the towering room, he saw hundreds of clones within an instant, and in the same moment, he felt shame. A sudden shock of grief covered his entire body, leaving him to take a deep and heavy breath. He sat down and looked up, using his hands to hold his back from hitting the floor. He spoke aimlessly to himself, knowing that no one else was in here, and no one else was going to listen. Jango then got to his feet and walked up to the computer console for the incubators, because he wanted to read more about this clone army. On the device, information for age acceleration, brain enhancements, and eventually the inhibitor chips showed up. Jango wondered if any of these chips would be placed in his own son, because that wasn't something he wanted for Boba. Though the deeper he read on these chips, the more consumed with frustration he became. Jango read until his eyes sealed shut, and when he woke up, he was back inside of his own, fully furnished room. This didn't feel right to him. Did he imagine what he had read? Did he fall asleep in the main bay and someone brought him back? Did someone knock him out and place him in his bed? Jango literally had no clue, so he flung himself off of his bed. Just as he readied a pistol into his hand, a knock came at the door. He slowly opened it, surprised to see the chief medical scientist herself. Nala Se asked if he would like to see the first batch of clones before he left. Fett's facial reactions forced Nala to ask if he was feeling okay, and he nodded his head, asking her if anything weird happened last night. She shook her head, not even knowing about his investigation into the incubator database. Truthfully, even if she did know, she wouldn't really care. Jango was an asset to their program, and his loyalty and understanding were needed for complete transparency throughout this process. After believing that he had been dreaming, he told Nala Se to give him a moment. He put his pistol down and examined his journal, finding that he hadn't added a date for the previous evening, confirming that either he didn't see anything, or he simply was too tired to write it down. He and Nala Se would march down to the first training room. The children present were all infants, and they were the first batch of troopers, 50 at count, with only 4 of them having died off in the transfer from the incubators to the facility. Obviously, the first batch of clones were being used as test dummies. Everything else after would perfect any inconsistencies with their cloning and their process. Jango nodded and listened, before interrupting and jerking their conversation off into a different direction. He asked if these children had any chips in their heads. Nala Se squinted and looked down at her tablet, seeing the inhibitor chip on her page, asking if he had seen it by accident. Jango didn't move his head or respond, so she read his face as a yes. She explained that per Tyrannus' request, the clones needed to have these inhibitor chips. They were both to make sure the clones remained docile as troopers compared to the free mind that Jango Fett had himself. They couldn't really have an army of Jangos without changing their minds to be a little less hyperactive. She searched for a laugh, but got a blank stare. Nala continued, explaining that Tyrannus also wished to have a failsafe, and considering Jango was the genetic host, he might as well have access to it as well. Truthfully, she and the other scientists would have given it to her earlier, but he didn't seem all that interested in the clones since meeting Boba, let alone hearing about them, so she just let him look through the documents. Not more than a minute passed before Jango got defensive. He told them to take those chips out of their heads, and a surprised Nalase watched him in confusion. He explained that it wasn't ethical, these were living beings and willingly controlling them without their consent wasn't right. From a bounty hunter, this was completely blindsiding. I mean, Nalase knew what Jango did to people. He had mutilated some, tortured others, thrown people into carbon freezing hell, he even forced people to do things against their will. But now he's on some moral high. She asked what prompted this, before answering her own question nearly immediately. The issue wasn't that Jango Fett was a bounty hunter, it was that he had become attached to them. Perhaps there was something missing in Jango's past that led to him becoming defensive and protective over the clones. But to avoid any troubles for herself, she promised that the batch currently in the incubators would have their inhibitor chips replaced, with only a minor behavioral change chip implanted, which would keep the clones docile once they became troopers. Jango smiled warmly and asked that they continue with the group of infants before them. While Nalase maintained the status quo for the time being, she made an extra note in her datapad to continue the inhibitor chip program with future groups. She assumed that Jango wouldn't check, taking her word at face value and trusting it, because the Kaminoans and Jango had to be completely transparent as of this far. As a means to distract Jango, she would use Omega as another person to focus on, and it worked like a charm. He initially didn't want a daughter, but slowly Jango started to feel fulfilled by having both a son and a daughter. Obviously, Nalase had to create another clone to be her lab rat, but it made her happy knowing that Jango wasn't concerned with the inhibitor chips. Tyrannus was absolutely informed by this, and he would handle it on his side. Dooku didn't know that Nalase actually removed the chips from the first batch of clones, but he wouldn't really care anyways, similarly to her and their information of these chips. Most of the Gen 1 clones wouldn't live till Order 66, and if they did, who cares? They'd be killed by their own brothers for resisting. However, this led to Tyrannus speaking with Jango directly. Their conversation wouldn't be tense, but it would include a minor pay cut, which Jango would willingly take, because he believed that his clones wouldn't have their inhibitor chips. It was a win-win for Dooku. He would save money while continuing to do the same thing he already planned on doing. He would also use this extra money to take himself for a little vacation to a luxury resort, which would take him all the way to Skull Ridge Mountain Hotel and Spa. It was luxurious, and he even got to relax his mind for a weekend hanging out with the Hutts. After years of trusting the Kaminoans and years of going on and off of Kamino to do personal missions, Jango would find that he had been betrayed. By this point, the Clone Wars were set to kick off in the coming 2 years, i.e., 8 years had passed by. The Confederacy wasn't yet a full threat, and most of the necessary systems hadn't seceded yet. Raxus was on the brink of doing so, which would be the domino effect to bring the Separatists into a legitimate movement. Jango was returning from another lovely fight with scum out on Quen. He was hired by local security to put down a pirate kingpin. It was a grueling month, but he was unscathed and finally home to see his kids. Not just Boba and Omega, but all the clones. Firstly, he absolutely adored Omega and Boba, and they adored him. Omega's name stuck because, truthfully, he liked her name a lot. Secondly, as Jango saw the clones as his children, they viewed him as their father. This, for Boba and Omega, meant that they too had relationships with all of their brothers. The two unaltered clones hadn't grown to see themselves as better than the regular CT clones. Instead, they valued them like siblings and even spent a lot of time with them. It was a bit challenging because for Omega and Boba, many of their best friends grew up a lot faster than they did. It didn't mean that they didn't keep their relationships, it just meant that they couldn't really keep things as close. That was perhaps the biggest challenge, aside from Dad Fett being gone for long periods of time. But because Boba and Omega had each other, they weren't as lonely. Both the children were exceptionally trained by Jango and by the Kaminoan hired trainers, so they could handle themselves if need be. Every time Jango returned home, he'd bring them a couple gifts, and then spend the first full day at home with them. Sometimes this would turn into 2 or 3 days. He adored his kids, and it really was refreshing being with them, away from other bounty hunters. The two children were familiar with the bounty hunting game and the scum of the galaxy, because Jango had showed it to them. Regardless, after spending his first 2 days with his personal kids, he would go around and visit all the clones. The army was growing. Most of the boys were pushing 16, 15, and even 14 years old, and all of them were able-bodied fighters. The younger groups of 13 and down were still cadets, but equally as excited to see their dad. None of the clones felt animosity towards Boba or Omega, because they were such joys to be around. The sense of brotherhood and camaraderie extended to each of the kids without the accelerated aging. Anyways, Jango made his best effort to spend time with groups of clones and his own children. It was a big, happy family on Kamino, but there was tension growing. Jango, within the first few days since being back, had noticed differences with the eldest group of clones and those younger than them. Ironically, it had nothing to do with behavioral differences. Well, technically it did, but it wasn't like the younger clones were more or less excitable. They were actually more dormant, with less personalities. It reminded Jango of his account of the infants when he first learned about the inhibitor chips. The first 50 clones were still out and about, though most of them had been transitioned into either ARC Trooper programs or the Commando one. Jango, similar to what he had done years before, would sneak out to investigate in the middle of the night. This time there was security, and he knocked them senseless with his bare hands. He had become suspicious in the last few years, but the love of his children and more job offers pulled him away from actually getting to know the truth. Now though, he did as he had before. The control console didn't have any information, aside from the new batches, which sickeningly revealed the truth about the current clones in production. Thanks to Omega befriending Nala Se's lab rat, named She, Omega was able to inform her father of the location of what he was looking for. The Kaminoans had always used the archive room, but had no need for it to hold the inhibitor chip data until Jango started poking around for information. What Jango learned upon his entry would sicken him, so much so that he forced Boba and Omega to hide inside of Slave 1. He suited up, and when he entered the facility he was faced by Nala Se. She tried to calm him down, having seen that an unauthorized personnel accessed the archives, and without even hesitating, he pulled his pistol to her face and fired it. She dropped instantly. Jango quickly made a move for the Prime Minister. As he got there, he killed him with a single blast too, when he heard a lightsaber ignite from behind him. The Kaminoans had been in close contact with Dooku over Jango's behavior, and he was seen as a potential risk. They were keeping him around just in case issues happened with the genome, but they didn't want to cause any disruptions, because they needed his genes. Dooku was alerted the moment Nala Se was, and it took Jango a little too long to get his children up and out of their rooms to his ship. They were both prepared to pilot it in case they needed to. Jango turned around after sending out a reprogram code to one of the medical droids within the facility, and looked at a much older Tyrannus. They'd spoken a few times, but the employer told him to stand down. Realizing that the man who hired him was a Jedi, Jango became infuriated. Those rancid Jedi had killed several of his brothers and sisters. Their deaths would be avenged here. Jango fired away, his pistols ricocheting off of Dooku's sabers as he lunged forward. The dark side user attempted to stab the bounty hunter, but he rolled out of the way, using his jetpack and getting some distance. He shot rockets off from his knees at his opponent, which Dooku shielded himself from. The Mandalorian bounty hunter continued around the room before using his flamethrower to burn the Sith, but it didn't hit him. Jango started a fighting retreat out of the facility, which Dooku pursued with ease. The experienced duelist and Force user flung electricity at Jango, which nearly caused him to die, but it was during this engagement that he realized that Tyrannus wasn't just any Jedi. He was some dark adept of their powers and their weapons. He hadn't ever seen a Jedi use these attacks before, with a red lightsaber, and he was quickly defending himself, channeling all of his skills to continue his fighting retreat. By the time they got to one of the landing platforms, a couple Magna Guards were rushing to the facility. Jango was able to signal his kids to get the ship moving, but after he made the signal, he struck blood. Dooku got within arm's reach of Jango for the first time since they were in Lama Su's quarters, which allowed Jango to blast Dooku in the nose, shattering it completely. He whipped his lightsaber back, and Jango shot his forearm forward, releasing fire into Dooku's face, completely burning his eyes and blinding him. The Magna Guards were the saving grace, because Jango would have executed Dooku, but he had to fly back onto the ramp of the ship, where he'd be traced by one of the guards. A brawl would commence, but he would kill the droid before fleeing from Kamino. The family would land out on Saleucami, where Jango would be able to spend a couple of days regathering his thoughts. Omega and Boba were very supportive of returning to Kamino to save their brothers, which Jango was too. He hadn't realized the damage he did to Dooku before he left. What he didn't know is that Dooku wasn't able to see at all. The backup Kaminoan scientists were trying to replace Dooku's eyes with cloning, and it wasn't going perfectly, yet. As for the clones, they were a little suspicious because of everything going on. Lama Su and Nala Se were completely dead, executed by apparently Jango, and many of the clones wanted to know why. New leadership for Tipoca City didn't want to activate the emergency orders, but they feared having to, because of how resistant the clones were becoming. Due to the relationship the clones had with Jango, they believed he did it for a good reason. While on Saleucami, Jango would accidentally run into some actual Jedi. They weren't really concerned with him, but being that Jango was on edge, he threatened them without provocation, demanding to know why one of their own was on Kamino. Quinlan Vos and his student, Aayla Secura, had no knowledge of Kamino, let alone Jedi presence on the planet. Jango was still under the belief that the Jedi had ordered the clone army, which yes, technically they did, but he didn't understand that Tyrannus was a completely different sect of Force users. There was no reason for him to know the difference anyways, but still. However, because this was Quinlan Vos and Aayla Secura, they weren't willing to just let the Mandalorian bounty hunter off without more questions, because if there was a quote-unquote dark Jedi, then it was their responsibility to investigate. Jango was not at all interested in keeping the Jedi around, but if he could get added reinforcements to deal with Dooku, then he would. He was an opportunist. The trio departed back for Kamino, and sure enough, they'd find the Count. Though, because Jango was leading this, it would be unorthodox, even for Quinlan standards. See, while Jango was playing with big Nexu kitties on Saleucami, the Kaminoan scientists were falling upwards. Dooku had 4 sets of eye replacements, and his skin was super inflamed. Some eyes worked alright, when the other half didn't. One set of eyes caused ringing in his ears, and another almost had him comforting in the pool of Abrax. Didn't matter though. Jango bursted through the door, shot the few medical scientists dead, and then clobbered Dooku before blowing his head clean off. Well, good thing he didn't overreact. Quinlan was a little annoyed, but he would deal with it from here. Aayla would inform the Council to dispatch a few Jedi because of potential Sith-related activities. While she was sending a transmission, she eyed a hooded figure entering the facility on another landing platform. She requested as many Jedi as they could gather. Aayla, Quinlan, and Jango spoke about the inhibitor chips prior to coming here, and while Jango didn't care about the Jedi in the slightest, he did inform them about Order 66. This wasn't for anything other than manipulation to protect his clones, and he did have Quinlan's honor to defend the clones from being abused or manipulated. Jango hated the Order, but he knew that a Jedi stood on their honor and on their code, which is why he trusted the Jedi Master to join him if he told him about Order 66. Anyways, they received a panicked call from Aayla Secura, informing them that a hooded figure was coming. Neither bounty hunter nor Jedi Master knew what a hooded figure was, but fearing for the worst, he told Aayla to get to Jango's ship and take the kids far away from the planet. Whatever was coming would surely be problematic. Fett, thanks to sending out that reprogram a few days before, had a false sense of security. He thought that every clone would have had their chips removed. They luckily trusted Jango because the droid informed them that the command came from their father, but the droid couldn't finish everything, not to mention the chaos with Nala Se and Lama Su being dead and new leadership taking command. Jango grabbed a lever and pulled it hard, alerting the facility to an attacker present. The panic on Voss's face gave Jango all the more reason to be concerned about this approaching threat. Plus, it would help if the clones helped apprehend whoever was here. But even Fett was concerned, because whatever was coming, whether it be a Dark Jedi, a Sith, or whatever the Jedi Master called Dooku, that was coming here to fight them, and he had fought that power before. However, if Jango could blind someone like Tyrannus, then surely whatever came next wouldn't be a challenge. Well, calling security to show up was a big mistake, because the mixed group of clones would be reprogrammed with a volley of executive orders, read off by Palpatine. Though that showed the first sign of problems. Not every clone reacted, and so while some pledged loyalty to Palpatine, others questioned their rationale. Initially, this would lead to a physical brawl, But as Sidious moved to counter the Jedi present on the planet, based on their T6 shuttle on the landing pad, these brawls turned into battles. Clones would accompany Sidious, killing any clone that did not join him, which forced those not affected by the initial commands to fire back. It was like a spreading plague. It started off small because Sidious first issued out the order to 20 or so men. About 14 of them acted on the command, and those not engaged in brawls with their brothers relayed those orders out across the facility. Quinlan and Jango first heard the blaster fire and yells before they saw the Sith, but the usually cool-minded Jedi told his bounty hunter ally to lock the Criff in, because this was the real deal. Jango planted his helmet on his head and whipped out his Westars. He initially had them set for stun, which he would use on clones who raised weapons at them. It slowly became clear that the inhibitor chips were working, because Quinlan was a main target as soon as he was seen. This came without any provocation. The Jedi Master did everything within his power to spare the clones, because he knew that they meant something to Jango. This was a far cry from what Fett had come to know the Jedi as, but he readily fought beside his newfound ally. They moved through the facility, which felt like it took several hours. By this point, Ayla had gotten Omega and Boba to the shuttle and off of Tipoca City. Sidious was elsewhere. He had gathered up every Kaminoan and told them to stay put. Afterwards, he found Dooku's smashed body. This alerted him to be more wary of whichever Jedi was present, assuming that Windu had been there, or maybe even Pong Krell, perhaps even Yoda. When Palpatine turned the corner, he saw a green lightsaber and a dark blue Mandalorian. Now, a Jedi and a Mandalorian is not a common sight to see. He pointed forward, and the clones rushed them from behind. Jango whipped around, standing behind Quinlan's back and taking a few shots to the body before seeing the hooded man. He leaned over and launched a rocket. It sped past his clones and obliterated the ground before Sidious, pushing him back, but not very far. He readied his lightsabers, and Quinlan, now finally free from fighting off clones, realized what Jango had released on them. He pushed Jango to the side and raised his weapon forward, quickly blocking Sidious's assault. Their weapons collided and Voss slipped back, as Palpatine's rapid assault was nearly too much to defend. More clones piled in through the halls, alerted to the explosion. Luckily for the Jedi and Mando, they were allies. This allowed Jango to turn around and attack the Sith from behind. Palpatine was incredible. He pressed the assault while also blocking every blast for his back. Jango was now set to kill, and even that wasn't aiding in anything. Quinlan ducked away before being kicked through glass down towards the main training center. Hundreds of thousands of clones were fighting each other. Their fists were balled and swinging. Some of the men were jumping on top of each other, or tackling their brothers. They had engaged because reports were coming in about the Jedi being seen with Jango. Some men wanted to kill their father. Others wanted to save him. Jango smacked his helmet, trying to remember the failsafe code, but it wasn't coming to mind. However, this Sith was a greater threat than anything else right now. He jumped out, igniting his jetpack and tackling Sidious mid-air, pinning the Sith's elbows to his chest as they both slammed into a pillar by mistake. Jango's pack flipped off and slid across the pristine floors. He pulled himself back as a couple of his boys charged Sidious, each getting cut down, but saving Jango from a near instantaneous death. Beside Jango, Quinlan flung a group of clones off of him, using the Force. Sidious jumped for Fett, but a thrown lightsaber saved his life, and the bounty hunter jumped up, moving around as Quinlan and Palpatine re-engaged. Their fight was heavy, but Voss would never last, even with his allies on the way. Palpatine slung his saber down, through Quinlan's knee, and it buckled, but the Jedi placed his saber above his head, defending himself from another strike from Palpatine. Jango ran up and kicked Sidious's wrist with his shin, shattering the bone, but getting pulled across the floor and electrocuted in one movement. The clones were no help, and Quinlan looked back to Jango as if to say, "Look after my Padawan," before his head was removed. Sidious marched at Jango, who, still in shock, struggled to pull his pistols. He fired away, and the few free clones on his side attacked Sidious, but they were no match. Jango was out of tricks and out of ideas, but maybe he wasn't. He fired at Palpatine and intentionally missed, hitting a pillar. Sidious just continued to edgewalk, finding this adorable. The fastest gunslinger in the galaxy missing every shot, Jango jumped to his feet and turned all the way around, getting behind Palpatine as they marched in a circle. Sidious got tired of this and swung at the bounty hunter, missing him, and then slashing the bottom of the pillar, as Jango leapt over a strike and used his jetpack to avoid another. Using his grapple, He pulled the pillar down, and Sidious used his remarkable strength to hold it with the Force. He pushed it up, hovering it above himself. When a clone then fired into his ankle, Palpatine's immense focus was shattered, but not long enough to kill him. He would hold on, using his saber and flinging it at clones, utilizing the Force on both objectives, to protect his head while also kill his enemies. Jango fired his pistols, avoiding the deflections and ramped his saber. Palpatine finally got close to breaking free, when Jango, sliding under the still flying lightsaber, used his grapple again and threw it forward. It caught Palpatine's leg, and Jango, using his jetpack, flung himself forward before planting his wrist blade into the ground and nearly ripping his arm out. The jolt was so violent it twisted Palpatine's leg around his other, forcing him to collapse, and as such, dropping the pillar on top of him, which would kill him. Quinlan's body would remain trapped until the Jedi arrived, but by the time they did, the clones had been given Order 150, and the Kaminoans were executed by Jango's hand. He limped to meet the Jedi and informed them that it was always an honor to meet a Jedi, but this time he actually meant it. They had saved his life and protected Omega and Boba, which meant more than the galaxy to him. This especially went to Aayla Secura. Those who arrived would be very confused, especially Grandmaster Yoda, but they would have much to discuss. Jango's actions against the Kaminoans weren't warranted in the eyes of the Jedi, but they could also not confirm that they'd been executed by the bounty hunter. Just don't mind that all their bodies have been killed in the same few rooms. As per their investigation, they would confirm the destruction of the Sith, which would spare a future General Grievous from being transformed into a cyborg, and it also would allow Ventress to return to Dathomir, never leading to Maul's discovery. The Order would learn of Sifo Dyas' involvement, and that would domino down into the revelation of his death, per Dooku's orders. It was a messy situation, but in it, they were able to save the Republic from a complete destruction. Flipping the script with Jango as a witness, they would blame Palpatine, the Chancellor, not the Sith, for having ordered the clone army, and using Dooku as an asset to build a resistance, to start a war. The Jedi would take everything from here, promising that legislation would protect the clones from any unfair or unjust treatment because it wasn't their fault, though the clones would never have to worry about that. Jango did take some public backlash because he took the job, but truthfully, once his payment was revealed, no one could really blame him. What became difficult for Jango was the whole 40-year-old virgin thing that he had going on, with a couple 100,000 clones looking for a home to go to. Jango wasn't known for really being a public servant, so he continued training the clones and absolutely gutted the Death Watch for fun. That would happen in a couple years though. Thanks to the timing of when he did it, it would elicit a positive reaction from Satine. It wasn't positive as in, oh happy days, but like a, oh thank you for saving me from these psychos. Jango had the distinct honor of cutting Pre Vizsla's head off in front of surviving Death Watch members, and he adored it. And then he killed them all, aside from Bo-Katan per Satine's request. The clones, as a result, would be given Concordia and be allowed to work for the Mandalorian government in exchange for protection, which would help greatly with the still neutral system grow prosperously, as the Republic continued to fend off the threat of a true separatist movement, not from a government, but from the Council. Without the Federation joining the CIS Council that Dooku assembled, it would fall apart, and the threat of war would deteriorate after 3 years of tension. There'd be a whole assimilation process for the clones, but Satine would be fair and kind to them, which earned a ton of respect from Jango. Boba and Omega would grow up with a loving father, and Jango's commitment to bounty hunting would go away, because the clones were given government contracts and treated like part of Mandalorian culture, something the Death Watch never gave Jango the honor of. Prime Minister Almec, the traitor, never considered Jango one of them, but just because he was from Conquer Dawn, it didn't make him any less of a member of their society in Satine's eyes. She just preferred they not slaughter anyone in the Mandalore system, which Jango and the clones could absolutely agree to aside from pirates, which they did a couple times. The clone army became akin to a clan of Mandalore, Clan Fett. Jango was the leader of the group, and he would watch the clones continue to grow up and find joys in life, as they built a completely new society on Concordia, one in relation to that on Mandalore. There would be scientists hired by the Mandalorian government to assist with the de-aging of the clones. It would work, eventually, but Jango would live a long, prosperous life with a massive family of hundreds of thousands of clones that all lovingly called him Dad. And that, my friends, is another wholesome PP story. Special thanks to all the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, There Are Cars, The Shade of Fear, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lindell Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexander Arista Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir Wellen 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny Naguin, Zanza Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Magnetic Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, the main three first names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about the PP. So this is like super wholesome. I love this kind of vibe here. Jango stories are always really fun because you can really play around with this character a lot and kind of delve into a softer side of him. Like in the story, he's still like a psycho badass bounty hunter, and that's great. But he also gets like this super happy ending where he's like, it's like, I don't know, 40-year-old version. He's just kind of living his life, hanging out with a bunch of kids that he kind of had, but he didn't also have because he didn't bang 100,000 times. You know what I'm saying? So I thought a story centralized with Jango kind of trying to build a relationship with the clones would be very interesting. We've done that with Boba, with the Clone Army, and with the Bad Batch. And so having the person who literally created the clones with his genome, I thought that'd be kind of like the perfect symmetry between all those stories. Anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.